Hey, now we have Antonio from San Francisco. Antonio was here in Pete and was an incredible thoughts and speak here in Pete. Thank you so much, Antonio, for being here with us. We really want to hear you talk about your thoughts. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. First of all, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, I hear.
All right.
Perfect.
Awesome. So I did have some slides. They're just kind of basic. So hopefully someone there is going to share them because it seems like my computer is not allowing it. But I'm going to just go ahead and start presenting. And I put a timer for myself because I really want to make sure that we have enough time for discussion and not just to be talking the whole time. So I'm going to set myself a little timer and put up the volume of the mic. Is this any better? If not, I could try to take off the headphones.
I think it's really good. I can hear you really well.
Okay, I will try to speak loud, and there are my slides. All right, so I am going to talk about the overlaps of these different concepts and a little bit talk about land reform related to anarchism, degrowth, and food sovereignty. And I'm not going to talk much about myself, but I will give a little introduction. The next slide has some points that I just want to present. So first of all, these ideas, of course, come out of decades of involvement in related movements and discussions with various people. So of course, they're my ideas, but they're only my ideas because I shared them and have discussed them with many other people. And I wrote 2 papers that talk about both land reform focused and another one about these overlaps between anarchism, food sovereignty, and degrowth. But neither of these papers is to sort of settle the debate and say, here's the right way forward, because I tend to try to stay away from this kind of idea that there's the right political line and that everyone should take it, because I don't think we'll ever have political certainty or alignment among all of our movements around what the right way to go, right? So I think it's easy, of course, to shit on other people's theories of change and their strategies and say, oh, well, they don't work, but my shit works. But we know that we live in a capitalist doomscape where nothing that we've done to overthrow that system has necessarily worked overall, and nothing is certain to work, right? So we just got to figure out our way forward with a little bit of humility. So I do come into this presentation and to these issues with my heart located in an anarchist ethic and idea of how we should live individually today, as well as what kind of world we could live if we made it so. But I'm also an anti-dogmatist, so that means I don't think anarchism is necessarily appropriate for every and all problem, right? So you might be a little disappointed if you're looking for a sort of validation only of your existing anarchist sentiments. And I acknowledge before I start that I'm not going to talk about a lot of current events and things that are obviously relevant, because this presentation is sort of a little bit abstracted out from that day-to-day practice. All right, so go to the next slide. So I'm just going to go through essentially the slides are what is anarchism good for with regards to degrowth and food sovereignty, and then secondly, what is anarchism not so good for? And for those who are unfamiliar, I'm going to assume everyone who's listening is at least somewhat familiar with anarchism itself and the many diverse anarchisms that could be found within that broader term. Similarly, right, degrowth and food sovereignty are both concepts and social movements which also encompass a lot of diversity within them, right? This is something that I think anarchists are more likely to understand and accept than a lot of sort of hardline kind of leftist movements that wish to simplify and have the proper definition for something. So I'm going to try to give a short sort of overall definition for each of these, knowing that, of course, within each category is a lot of diversity. So degrowth, in short, is essentially the acknowledgement that there needs to be a reduction in the material usage of particularly the rich countries of the world, essentially what we call the global north, or places where the average ways that people live is under what we call the imperial mode of living, right? Requiring imperialism for their sort of day-to-day necessities. And so degrowth says we need to degrow aspects of the economy which are causing environmental destruction at the same time that they're built upon and reinforce social injustices, particularly between global north and south. And so degrowth is about reducing basically the threat that the economy, the capitalist economy, presents. It is explicitly anti-capitalist, at least in the ways that I use it. And more so than food sovereignty, I would say degrowth is an idea and something that people find work that fits into degrowth, rather than it's as much of a movement in its own. There's not a lot of people who say, I am a part of a degrowth movement, whereas food sovereignty, on the other hand, is also a concept, a sort of proposal, an idea to orient our politics around. But it also has a lot more of what we could say is an actual base in social movements, and in particular, social movements of the global south. Although food sovereignty also has a lot of proponents and activists in the global north. So yeah, essentially degrowth is about the macroeconomy and changing the economy and changing political structures for that transition. And food sovereignty is about the right of people, aside from states and corporations, to determine their own food and farming systems at various levels. And so there are two different ideas that do have overlaps and some engagement, especially in recent years. But I'm going to just go start with the degrowth side and give a little point-by-point sort of what are some of the ways that anarchism is maybe helpful or good for thinking about degrowth. So the first would be that that anarchism is a lot more attuned to and has been shown to be very much effective in disaster response, right? In conditions where what we call natural disasters, which are always also social political disasters, that anarchistic forms of organization are more flexible and responsive and ground-based, and so able to provide a response when oftentimes the established structures of state societies fail to respond, right? So both in terms of response and also to some degree in terms of preparing for disasters, anarchists have been some of the milieu that have been sort of most effective. So you might think about Hurricane Katrina in 2005 in New Orleans, and the Common Ground Collective and other examples like that. Occupy Sandy in 2012, etc. Another thing that anarchism is good for is that it tends to focus, its politics are really focused on direct action as opposed to various forms of mediated action, which are prioritized and liberal and social democratic and other forms of change making. And that direct action can be thought of in many cases as a form of degrowth and action. So we can think of the many direct actions that have directly shut down the lignite coal mines in Germany, which are proven basically climate time bombs, and that thousands of people directly put their bodies on the line to obstruct the continual extraction of these fossil fuels. We can think of the zones to defend in France, where both independent activist types as well as locals who are involved in agriculture and other sort of rural lifestyles or livelihoods, to say, came together to say, no, we don't accept modern development plans in our territories, which are going to destroy our ecology and our ways of life, and have basically directly interfered with those development plans. We can look at examples from Indonesia, where peasants who have been basically expropriated of their lands and become landless have reclaimed what were considered plantation territories owned by corporations through direct action, creating their own autonomous communities, growing various crops for both market and subsistence, right? Directly creating a more convivial and localized economy based off of people's needs, as opposed to some sort of capitalistic infrastructure. So direct action is definitely something that I think anarchists are not the only groups that do direct action, but tend to have a priority placed on direct action compared to a lot of other political movements or ideas or ideologies. Another thing anarchists really focus on is to create the world of the future that we want to see in the present, right? This prefigurative politics, which tends to prioritize building of interventions now in the moment, even though those same interventions might get institutionalized or taken up by powerful players, whether in the state or in capitalist firms. So we can think of examples like the anarchist agitation, propaganda, artistic movement called Provo in the Netherlands in the 60s. They essentially pioneered this idea of, hey, we shouldn't have a car-based infrastructure. We should have bikes and walking and more convivial, localized, and less harmful forms of transportation. So they created the white bike program, where they painted a bunch of bikes white and left them out in the public squares and said anyone should be able to use these bikes and basically, use them freely, not to hoard them as private property, but as a form of commons. And that white bike movement, which did partly contribute to the transformation of the Netherlands away from car culture and towards the sort of bike-friendly country it's often seen as now. But it also was institutionalized in various bike share programs where, for those of you who are there in New York City, right, it's like owned by Citi, which is literally a bank, or is it, I can't remember how many different corporations have owned these bike share programs. But the point is, bike sharing, which is definitely a degrowth adjacent kind of tool or technology, is something that is precipitated by or energized by, sparked by anarchist groups, and then institutionalized, for better or for worse. Another thing that anarchism, I would say, emphasizes, similarly to direct action, is the fact that we don't see political action as simply a means to an end, but actually its own sort of end, right? We see doing political action as a form of political education, as creating ourselves and our values and our knowledge of who we individually and collectively are. So what we call subject creation, right? It doesn't just form the world out there, it forms us as we do it. And of course, we focus a lot of times when you see a lot of programs like the Anarchist Book Fair and in free schools and various mechanisms that anarchists for generations have created to spread knowledge that is concrete and applicable to people's lives, right? So there's a real focus in that. And I think in that sense, degrowth really needs a lot of this grassroots level political education, subject formation, and concrete knowledge spread, because at this point we live in a society where people don't even necessarily, by and large, understand the problems of economic growth. Another thing that, once again, is not unique to anarchists, but certainly anarchists have emphasized, is the critique of state power as being an underpinning for the kinds of noxious, toxic growth that the economy promotes. So, whereas, for example, a lot of times Marxists might really explain more of the growth fixation, the growth orientation of the economy in terms of the needs and aspirations of capitalists, there's a lot more focus in anarchism on how the state has its own incentive structures, which promote this growth imperative at all costs as well. I'm just switched to I'm staying on the same slide, but hold on, give me a second. And the last thing I think that is really important for degrowth, in particular in the context of a place like the US, or we could say the global North at large, is that this anarchist or anarchistic critique of the nonprofit industrial complex as counter to the radical or revolutionary kinds of changes that we actually need to reach a degrowth world, right? That critique says we're not going to get there through the form of the nonprofit, which is by and large the way that a lot of social activist-oriented people tend to form themselves in order to make change. And so by critiquing various forms of hierarchical structures, whether they be the state or nonprofits that are organized in a sort of corporatized fashion, anarchism really emphasizes a lot of the problems of trying to reach degrowth through these conventional, let's say, means. Then moving to food sovereignty. So what is sort of beneficial about anarchism for food sovereignty? Well, the one thing I want to start by saying is you have to acknowledge that across history and across many different locations, right, peasants as a class, the folks who are at the base of the food system in terms of producing food, who today, even though we have a corporate industrial food system that it's asserting itself, let's say, dominating around the planet more and more, still peasants produce anywhere from 50 to 70% of the world's food, depending on what estimates you believe. The point is peasants still exist as a class, and they are very important to food systems and food availability globally. And the reality for anarchists to admit is that peasants have had various sort of, let's say, overlaps with state power, right? Some peasant movements have been very oriented towards state power in the past, as well as in the present. And so I by no means am trying to claim peasants as a class for anarchism. But at the same time, there are many ways in which the ethics, the politics, the desires, the goals of food sovereignty as a concept and food sovereignty movements as the practitioners or the proponents of food sovereignty, there's a lot of overlaps between what these movements have to say and what they do and anarchism and anarchist ideas. So just to quickly go over some of those, right? So we have localization, this idea that localizing power is important. Direct action, again, right? Both productive direct action that produces food that people need, or productive direct action in terms of mutual aid, the many mutual aid projects that anarchists do to feed people. There's also antagonistic direct action, burning down plantations of eucalyptus, genetically modified eucalyptus plantations, or again, sort of directly disrupting infrastructures of harm. But also there's an emphasis on autonomy, right? Physical autonomy, material autonomy that comes from producing your own necessities for survival, for subsistence, as well as that leading to more political autonomy to have the space to be able to fight the state, the corporations, and so on. There's also in anarchism an attention to power at the local level that calls into question various things that happen within the community, such as patriarchy, speciesism, the differences within peasant communities that might be harmful in addition to the struggles between the community and outsiders. There's also affinities with indigenous ontologies, ways of seeing things, and ways of organizing oneself and one's community. And there's a lot of nuance here in terms of course, there's a lot of support from anarchists for indigenous rejection of the state, especially the colonial, the settler colonial state. But there's not necessarily as much comfort with accepting when indigenous people claim nationhood and talk about wanting to build polities around their own nation. So, that can be a matter of debate. And importantly, of course, anarchism has critiqued what are called socialist states, some would call state capitalist states, but essentially these different times in history where people who called themselves communists or saw themselves as being anti-capitalist have created state forms that have also oppressed and suppressed peasant sectors and really undermined, if not directly murdered, those sectors, and also indigenous folks in their assertion of what their new utopia and socialism was. All right, next slide. I have to hurry up because I just looked at my time, so I'm not going to overlap too much. So secondly is, what is anarchism not so good for? All right, so in terms of degrowth, I would argue that for the most part, for most people in most places on the planet, people are attached to what we might call the politics of normalcy. They want the everyday life to be as undisturbed by sudden upheavals and lack of access to things like food and electricity, the internet, and so on. Right. And of course, more access to these things is held by people who have this imperial mode of living. And so we might call into question the politics of normalcy, especially since degrowth is really focused on the degrowth of the northern economies rather than a proposal specifically for poorer countries, which might need more forms of traditional economic development to reach basic qualities of life. But the point stands that no matter who we're talking about, anarchism doesn't often speak very well to people who are attached to or desiring this politics of normal everyday life. And it's only really in these disaster moments or parts of our worlds, our lives, when things are falling apart or coming into question, that I feel like anarchist ideas start to gain a little more resonance with, more everyday kinds of people. Secondly, we might put these two together, planning, right? The idea of planning for the future economy or system that we need to have our needs met through some organization of the very complex interdependence of our societies today, right? So planning for that change, planning for how a degrowth world will evolve over time. and the thing we call policy, ways that we create words that guide what we're supposed to be doing together in its most generic form. Policy and planning are both things which anarchists are by and large very disinterested in because are associated with this thing we call the state. Yet at the same time, both of those tools or both of those processes can help to structure institutions that allow people's choices to better escape from capitalist colonial ways of being. Maybe that's not straightforward enough, but what I'll explain is this. A welfare state is not in itself a liberatory thing, and we know that the welfare state in a country like the US, although it's being dismantled as we speak, is clearly built upon the continual extraction of people from the global south. So we, as people who care about everyone, can't just accept the welfare state as it is. But to the extent that people have their food, healthcare, housing, education, etc. needs met through things like welfare, they're more able to extricate themselves, to take themselves out of those systems of harm that are really at the core of the capitalist colonial economy. And that is a necessity for reaching towards degrowth. And so this question of how do you approach things like policy and planning is something that I think anarchism doesn't really think enough about. And a big perpetual argument between especially state communists and anarchists, of course, is how do you expropriate the expropriators? How do you actually forcefully take over infrastructure and territory from those who have usurped it from the masses for generations? Well, and I'd say anarchists don't have a very good force either on themselves in the present moment or a theoretical understanding of how that force would be developed in the absence of state power to expropriate the expropriators. In the paper, I, of course, argue that it's doubtful that the state would also have that force, given the histories we see of what states actually do. So we're left in a little bit of like, each side can claim the other side doesn't have an answer, but no one really has a good answer for this essential aspect of the degrowth transition. All right, and to wrap up for food sovereignty, you'll see some overlap with the other points, but right, anarchism doesn't really have a lot to say about state policy. What I found more and more in my work doing this work as a researcher and talking to folks who claim anarchism, sometimes not even sort of outwardly, but just when I talk to them, right? A lot of folks take anarchist ideas and do a lot of stuff with it. They don't necessarily stay at an arm's distance from the state. And some people I know are self-proclaimed anarchists who do work on policy. But as a philosophy, anarchism doesn't deal with the state or doesn't accept the state as a valid vehicle for progressive change. And so, right, in dealing with US agribusiness policies, right, or global governance policies that can really shape outcomes for peasant communities around the world, such as things that go on in the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, or all these discourses and instruments around human rights, which are all state-based instruments. Right, food sovereignty is very concerned with these things, and anarchism and anarchists tend to not really address them or haven't to a very deep extent from what I've seen. Similarly, anarchism lacks a theory of change for systems transformation as a whole, right? Arguably, right, there's a lot of theories in anarchism about direct action, prefigurative politics, a lot of things about what we can do, an ethics of practice, essentially, or praxis. But unlike Marxism, right, it doesn't have a lot of deeply theoretical works about how do we see, for example, non-market economies functioning so that we can get our food needs met at the same time that many other aspects of our complex economies might be extended, right? We don't know which parts need to go, which parts we retain, but how we even make those decisions as a society, how we end up at this non-extractive, food sovereign, degrowth political economy of the future, it's not really clear from anarchist theory, in my view, beyond sort of a focus on niche efforts, sort of the interstices of existing society, making our efforts there and hoping that in some sort of big crisis moment, some of these efforts get somehow amplified and expanded. I would note that in the paper, I don't even really get that deep into these debates, but there's a lot of really interesting debates among different flavors of anarchism between what's called, mutualism, which is essentially a form of sort of markets still existing, but not capitalist markets, that being compatible with anarchism, whereas other people say, no, you need to be anarcho-communist, right? Different theories of value, what is value, how is it created? There's a lot of, I think, interesting stuff that we haven't figured out there. But specifically for food sovereignty, that's something that I think is imperative, because food sovereignty is built from, as I mentioned, peasants as a class who still are very involved in various kinds of markets, sometimes local markets that are relatively embedded in local communities, sometimes international markets, right? Even the Zapatistas are selling coffee internationally, right? So how do we deal with the transition and the desire to get to a non-market economy through anarchism? And lastly, anarchism doesn't really have a way of resolving this ultimate question that has been debated for decades now in food sovereignty, both in the movement and in academic context of what is sovereignty? Who is the sovereign in food sovereignty, right? It's obviously not corporations, but does it mean it's the state? Does it mean it's local communities? What is the relationship between different local communities or these divisions within local communities, right? The sovereignty in food sovereignty is still very unclear, and anarchists don't have answers to it. All right, since my alarm went off, I'm going to stop there. I think I had one more slide, but it was just more of a sort of questions for folks, because I'm kind of curious to know. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about land reform, but I don't think I have enough time to go into it as much. So I'll just open it up for folks to ask questions or make comments. And then also want to reference that, I don't know if it's already shared, but the Agroecology Research-Action Collective, which I'm a member and organizer for, our website was broken and now it's relaunched. It's agroecologyresearchcollective.org. So if people want to find out more about the work we do, check that out. And yeah, open to questions and comments.
Wow, thank you so much, Antonio.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was really amazing listening to your thoughts.
We're waiting for some questions from online. If people from joining virtually have any questions, please feel free to ask them in the YouTube question chat. I'm not sure if anybody from the audience has any particular question.
You have it, good.
Cool. I could also talk about the land reform stuff. I just wanted to make space.
Yeah, please. I would like to. That's exactly be my thing. Develop a little bit more about that.
Okay.
Okay.
If we put that slide back up, I can.
Yeah.
Yeah, Jason can do it.
Okay, cool. Because I mean, in essence, I'll just start talking that for folks to know that I wrote this recent article called "Land Reform in the United States: A Lost Cause or a Cause that Simply Has Been Lost," because I wanted to draw attention to the fact that land reform is this global sort of social movement idea, and of course, land reform can be actually. Oh, it's a little bit, okay, yeah. So land reform, historically, could be literally thinking about the colonization and settlerization of the United States, right? Various state laws that basically took away lands from indigenous folks and gave them to white settlers. So land reform is not inherently progressive, right? But in this context, I'm talking about land reform that's oriented towards democratization of land access, and the recognition that the histories of the land we have today are histories of dispossession and violence, right? And in being able to redistribute, break land, wealth, power relations as they currently exist and redistribute that in order to make a more equal society, but also, of course, to develop the kinds of food systems that are more aligned with food sovereignty. So more based on local communities, providing for local needs, more based on agroecological methods, meaning methods of food production that are not raping the earth every day. And so, land reform is something that around the world is usually discussed in social movements of food sovereignty around integral agrarian reform, meaning that it's not just about land, it's about land in combination with access to capital, in combination with access to water, with support for agroecological development, whether that's local markets or actual research on agroecological methods, right? So land reform can be a big thing, but as I write here on the left, right, some or most would argue that land reform necessitates a state, that it's all about a state coming in and using those levers of policy power to redistribute land. And, historically, there have been a lot of, we can think of, the Russian Revolution of 1917, the Bolshevik Revolution was made off of the backs of both anarchist and left communist proposals from particularly the socialist revolutionaries, who were rooted more so in the peasant class, right? And they said the only real clear thing we need is land, right? We need these fuckers to give up their large estates, and we need to have that land. And so that demand was brought into the Bolshevik revolutionary platform, and to some degree that was what happened, at least initially, a little bit. The point is, right, so that land reforms can be revolutionary and associated with revolutions, but from a state power perspective. And then at the same time, there's been a lot of times that states, even under the influence of the United States itself, as a form of its imperialist reach, was to do land reforms in order to prevent this communist surgence from below of demand for a different system other than the colonial capitalist one, right? So land reform can also be anti-communist in a way, definitely anti-people. Right, it's kind of like anarchism obviously doesn't speak to the idea of a state-mandated land reform, and I would say the sort of simplistic anarchist answer or response would be, well, we're talking about direct action, building power from below to take back the land. We can look to examples like the MST in Brazil, who are certainly using a lot of direct action, but not explicitly anarchist, right? They're a sort of amalgam of different kinds of left revolutionary flavors, let's say. But they have a lot of top-down or sort of hierarchical components, as well as a lot of grassroots bottom-up components in their organization. But the point is they use sort of their own protagonism to get access to land, but it really succeeds to the extent that it's a function of the Constitution of Brazil that has a social use clause, which means that land has to fulfill a social function, and if it's being neglected or being underutilized, there is a right essentially under the Constitution for peasants or other social sectors to take ownership, take occupation of this land, and then petition for legalization of that right to be there. So again, even the direct action has a relationship to these state processes, and so we really need to think about that if we're going to propose a sort of anarchist approach to land reform. And I would say, another big problem is that, again, similar to my comment about degrowth and who's going to expropriate the expropriators, right? We know that the state is actually, violence is the state's strongest point. Especially, I'm from the United States. I live in the most violent state there is, with the most institutional apparatus, literally like the most guns, the most warplanes, the most anything that you can use to kill and destroy. My government's got it all, and they're not afraid to use it. So there's an obvious hesitancy, I think a reasonable hesitancy to think that we're going to achieve land reform to expropriate these large exploitative plantation agriculture that's all over our country and all over the world now, and use our own power to do that expropriation and not expect a violent response from the state. So that's one of my skepticisms of an anarchist sort of approach to land reform. But I do think we need to think about, again, the history of land reform. There are some positive examples, but essentially they tend to also have the problems that they create, because even if they're done for supposedly progressive, liberation-oriented reasons, right, they often recreate certain kinds of power structures, or they basically are ways to do developmentalist kind of things, like create a larger economy that's more successful in industrializing and therefore going down the path of what the rich countries have done. So there's a lot of questions there. And then the other thing I'd point to is that, at least in the United States context, and what I talk about in this paper, is that although there are movements, for example, black and brown farmers who are looking for access to land to do more agroecological food production and stewardship, but of course don't have the capital to do that, are looking for state support to access land, or looking for some form of land equity, they call it, right? The many movements that actually exist around issues of land and agroecology and reclamation based off of historic injustices are not really seeking to abolish the present state of things, or at least they're not talking about it in those ways, and at least they're not talking about doing it in any short order, right? So there are some revolutionary and radical positions or values within social movements in the United States of food justice and indigenous food sovereignty and so on. But there's not a lot of radical calls for the revolutionary transformation of land ownership. And I hear of almost no one who's directly talking about confronting those with landed power today in order to take away what has been expropriated, rather than to simply allow access through some policy mechanisms here and there. So for me, that's not necessarily an easy place to step into as someone who might think like an anarchist. And so, like I said already in point 5, right, policy might be an avenue for certain things that look like land reform, but not necessarily a broad land reform. But it's unlikely to be that good or that be that transformative. And the piecemeal solutions of, say, purchasing here and there, begging rich people to get rid of some of their land and give it to us, putting stuff into land trusts, which isn't a very good tool given the property system we have. Land trusts are one of the few ways we can take out the speculative value of land and just focus on what it actually does for producing what we need as humans and non-humans. But I would argue that these different like piecemeal solutions don't really together account for enough to think big enough for the transformation that we actually need, and which historically at least was what people meant by land reform, which was a large scale reshuffling of land rights and access and use. And lastly, and maybe a little cynically, or at least sadly, is to remember, that for people like myself who are really immersed in food sovereignty movements and, these very far left ideas, right? Most people in a place like the US, they can't even imagine not having bananas be available, right? A colonial crop that is only available by virtue of the continued imperial mode of living and the relationship between privileged northerners and non-privileged folks in the tropical areas that grow these bananas in plantation, horrible conditions, right? So like the fact that most people in the US still think that industrial agriculture is necessary to feed the world, can't imagine a world without bananas every day, that it's hard to imagine something like land reform picking up as a political demand when we have that level of existing knowledge and practice in relationship to food and agriculture today. So this is why I'll close here, that my complaint, my thing I've always been getting at is like folks who are on the far left and have all these ideas about the radical transformation of society and anti-capitalism and so on, need to get more familiar with food and land and how we exist every day in ways that are utterly dependent on a corporate industrial food system. And at the same time, folks who do this land and, food systems reform and environmentalism kind of stuff, they need to understand the limits to reformist tendencies using the capitalist state, right? They need to hopefully learn more from it. Anarchist, communist, indigenous comrades and leaders. So, I guess that's all I'll leave it with. And do note, yes, the website that's listed there is not the right one. It's Agroecology Research-Collective.org. Unfortunately, that doesn't mean we took out action. It's because we lost the website and had to buy a new URL. So that's what happened there. All right, I'll leave it there and see if there's any questions now.
Thank you so much. Yeah. We have like a finished time, we need to go.
Yeah, we're kind of just out of time, but
okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your amazing
overview. I mean, there's so much to think about there, and
Of course, read the papers. Write to me directly. Yeah. I'm going to go on a book tour next year, so I'd love to come meet you, hang out. I'll definitely be coming to Pitt, but anywhere else too.
Okay.
We'll welcome you then. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
They're first.
Good. Thank you.
Bye, Antonio.
See you all. Bye. Peace.